How's it going, everyone? This video is going to be a getting started guide for using AWS CDK with Python. So I'm going to show you how to get started with it and create some infrastructure. However, in order to do so, there are a bunch of prerequisites that you need to have sorted out. The first one is npm. This is by far the easiest way to install CDK. The second one we need is pip. Because we're using Python, we need to install some Python dependencies, and it is done using pip. And finally, we need the AWS CLI installed because the CDK library relies on the AWS CLI in order to deploy its resources. So I have some videos and resources on how to do all this. I'll leave some links to the description. But from this point forward, I'm just going to assume you have all of this installed because it is a requirement for this. So what we want to do first is we want to just open up our terminal, and we are here in Visual Studio Code. So I'm just opening up my terminal now so that we can get started. So the first thing is we want to install CDK, and using npm, the easiest way to do that is just to say npm install -g AWS CDK. And this is going to install globally the CDK CLI tool so that we can just type in CDK here, and this should work correctly. So you see here, there's all this garbage that came up, but I don't want to do that yet. Let's just confirm the version we have is most recent, just CDK version. Okay, we have the most recent, that's great. So let's just type in CDK --help, and that should bring up that previous page. So there are a couple useful commands that I want to tell you about before we get into the meat here. So the first one is CDK list, which lists all stacks in the application. We're going to go over what a stack is in a little bit, so don't worry about that. CDK synthesize. This generates your code into CloudFormation, which is how CDK deploys your resources to AWS. It's through a CloudFormation template. The third one is Bootstrap. Now, this isn't useful in all cases, but it's good to know what it does. So if there are AWS resources that in order to deploy your stack, you need to have those resources provisioned, you can do that using CDK Bootstrap. So it's kind of like a preliminary step. In addition, if the code that you write generates a CloudFormation file for deployment that is over 50 kilobytes, you're going to have to use CDK Bootstrap to update it. So just keep that in mind. We're not going to go anything near 50 kilobytes in this video, but just keep that in mind if you do in a production case. Next, we have CDK deploy, which is the command that we use to actually deploy out to AWS via CloudFormation. Then we have CDK destroy, which tears everything down. And then finally, we have CDK diff, which is a useful tool to see what's the difference between the code that I've generated and the CloudFormation that I've generated against what is existing on AWS. So it's a very handy tool to, make some changes locally, see how they may affect what exists on your AWS account before you actually run the CDK deploy command. So those are some of the commands that I think that you need to know about in order to work with CDK. So the next thing that we want to do is actually set up or configure our initial application. So there's a bunch of different ways to do this. If you want to start out with a very bare bones application that has like literally nothing, just raw files, and you have to fill everything in essentially, you can do so using the following command. So it's CDK init and app, and you just provide it the language that you want to use. So I'm going to be using Python here, but if you're using anything else, for example, TypeScript, you would put in whatever here. And this will generate all the project files that you need for the corresponding language. However, I do highly suggest you use a different command, which is going to set up a sample application for us, which is just going to kind of show you the ropes in terms of how all the constructs work, how everything fits together with a practical example. And then I'm going to modify it a little bit and show you how these resources get deployed for our specific use case. So in order to do that, we're going to say CDK init sample-app. And same thing, we're going to say language Python. So I just pressed enter there. So this is going to provision everything that we need. If I open up our project file here, you can see now we have all these new project files that were created. And so we're just going to give this a minute here to finish what it's doing. And if it takes too long, maybe you should go grab a coffee and come back. But actually, this just finished right away, so that's pretty good. So now what I want to do is just walk you through a bunch of the different files here that got created. So the first one is source.bat. Now, since I am on a Windows machine, a bat file is going to be generated. If you were just on a Mac or Linux, just a source file would be generated. And this is just a, let me close this terminal. So this file just runs a command essentially to set up your virtual environment for Python. Virtual environment is just a way to group your package dependencies so that you can install them to this local project and not pollute your global package namespace. So that's kind of why this is useful. Now we have a setup.py file. Now, one thing that I wanted to point out here, this just contains a lot of just random stuff that you probably don't ever need to modify. However, you may need to modify dependencies. Like for example, if you want to create a dynamo table, you need to import the construct that allows you to do that. And so this is where you would do that here. Under the install requires section, you would add your new dependency here. So we can see we have a bunch. We have IAM, SQS, SNS, SNS subscriptions, and S3. So that's what exists as a dependency for this initial project. But again, if you want anything different, you need to configure it here. Now, traditionally, this would be done through the requirements.txt file. However, you can see this is empty. So where this actually happens is right here. This is where kind of the dependencies are all put in place. So pip will know how to install everything. Then you also have a README. You can go and take a look at this to see kind of what's going on and understand a little bit more about the commands that are offered to you. However, I'm not going to really walk through that in this. CDK JSON, you probably never need to go here, but just know that it defines some configuration for your CDK project. Now app.py, this is an important file. This is kind of the entry point, I would say, for your CDK application. And you can see we're just doing some basic imports here, and we are creating a core.app and storing it in our app variable. Now you only have one app typically in a CDK project, and that's kind of your top level grouping. Within your app, you can have what are called stacks. And that's what this line here, should have highlighted. That's what this line here refers to. So we are creating a CDK getting started stack. We are passing it our app variable, and then we're naming this CDK getting started. So this is actually defined in another class or another file, and I'll show you that in a second. However, why do we have this? Why do we have this notion of stacks? Well, essentially, it's just a way for you to logically group different sections of your deployment. So for example, if I want to use this CDK setup to deploy a bunch of different infrastructure, I may create a stack that just deploys the infrastructure. For example, DynamoDB table, an SNS topic, and maybe an SQS queue. Now, alongside that, maybe I also want to deploy a dashboard, and I want to set up that dashboard to monitor those resources that I created. You may choose to create a different stack that contains your dashboard definition, and now having two separate ones, you can deploy those independently because some of these, if they're large enough, they can take quite a bit of time to deploy. So this is a nice way to organize your resources into logical collections that are fitting to your use case. So that's just an example of how this works in real life. So we do have this CDK getting started stack, which I want to show you. So just expanding this file here, or this folder, and opening up the CDK getting started.python file, we can see some things going on. So first of all, what I want to call out is that we can see our autocomplete isn't working. We can see we're having an import failure here. AWS CDK cannot be resolved. So if you are using Visual Studio Code, just a pro tip, you need to make sure the interpreter that you're using matches the interpreter that the CDK project is using. So a quick way to do that is do Control-Shift-P, and you can just find Python select interpreter here. I'm not sure what this command is on Mac, but you can probably just search for this, and then click on that. And I happen to know that what I'm using for this project is this bottom one here. You can see these are two different interpreters, and I'm going to click on that second one, and now you can see everything resolves correctly. So it's all configured and set up now. So just a pro tip for you if you were running into this problem. So taking a look at what's going on in this stack here, this section right here is where we are creating our resources. So we're creating our queue. We are using the SQS, wow, that's a big pop-up. We are using the SQS library to do that. We're calling the queue method. We're passing in ourselves a name and some properties. We're creating a SNS topic here, calling it CDK getting started topic. And then we are saying for this topic, I want to add a subscription to this queue. And then we're passing in the queue here. So you can kind of see how powerful this stuff is. If you had to do this through the console, probably take you half an hour to set up everything, make sure that you have all the permissions set up correctly, make sure that all the configuration is good, or kind of troubleshoot anything if it's not working. However, using these constructs that are provided by AWS makes it very, very easy for you to get started. But for this project, we are not going to be using any of these items because they're going to require some very special permissions, which I am not going to set up. So going back now to just our initial setup, I want to just bring up the terminal here to install all of our dependencies. So let me just clear what we had before out. So the first thing that we want to do is run this source.bat file. And if you're on a Mac, you just want to run it just doing, /source. And that should run that file to activate your virtual environment correctly. However, I am on a Windows, so I'm going to do /source.bat, and then it's just setting up that virtual environment for us. Let's clear that out as well. Now we want to install all of our dependencies. So I'm going to do pip install -r requirements.txt. You may be wondering why my dependencies were already installed here, like why autocomplete already worked. That's because I ran this command prior and it installed all this stuff to a common directory on my machine. So that's why everything kind of popped up right away. But after this completes, you should be good to go, and it should be resolving all these dependencies and autocomplete correctly. So we're just going to clear this out now, and we are ready to basically proceed to the next step, which is to create our S3 bucket. So I want to add a new dependency here. So I'm going to say AWS_S3 as S3. And don't forget your commas here, or else everything's going to blow up. Now I need to go and figure out how to use this library. So what I want to do is just bring up PyPy over here for the AWS CDK S3 library. And this is great for seeing some Python documentation on how all this stuff works. So for this specific one, let me make it a little bit bigger here. Gives us a demonstration of how to create our own bucket. This is using a encryption setting, which I don't want, but this is good enough for kind of a scaffolding to get our own setup going. So I'm going to copy that to my clipboard. I'm going to go back over to my project file here, and I'm just going to go and paste that in. And let's just make sure this is all good. Actually, I don't want this, so I'm just going to remove that. And bucket is not working correctly. So what's wrong here? Of course. So I need to say s3.bucket. So that should work. There we go. Don't forget to namespace it with whatever your dependency is here. Let's just clean this up a little bit too. And I'm just going to call this my special buckets -2021. Now remember, these need to be globally unique with S3. So if anyone has this name, this isn't going to work. So I'm just going to add some garbage here just in case to prevent any error from happening. Okay, so that's all we need to do from the resource creation perspective in terms of creating our bucket. Now what's going to happen when we synthesize our stack is that it's going to look at this stack, find that we're creating this bucket here. Of course, the app.py is going to run. So that's where the entry point is. It's going to generate all this stuff into CloudFormation and then deploy it to AWS. So there are a couple different steps that we need to do to make all of that happen. So let's bring up our terminal again. And in the terminal, I'm going to say now CDK synth. This is shorthand for CDK synthesize. And what this is going to do is it's going to take our local code and it is going to compile it into CloudFormation so that we can take a look at it. This is something I just like to do to make sure my code is doing what I expect it to do. Some of this stuff is just boilerplate that CDK generates. But if you scroll all the way down, scroll all the way up rather to the top, you see we're creating this resource, my special bucket 2021 with this special name. And it's an S3 bucket. It's adding some default properties here. So replace policy, deletion policy, and some metadata. So this is the actual name of my bucket that we're going to be creating. So this is kind of a cool kind of preview of everything that's going to get built when we deploy this out. So I'm just going to clear this now by typing clear. And in order to deploy this, what we need to do is type CDK deploy. And this is going to fail. And the reason this is going to fail with this particular failure reason is because the CDK tool is trying to kind of create all these resources, and it's relying on the user that we have configured for the AWS CLI. Now for me, I have a user configured that no longer exists, which is why I'm getting this error. However, if you have one that's like, you don't have permission to do this particular thing, you'll get a different error. So now what we need to do is go configure our AWS IAM user and policy so that we have some basic permissions that allow us to update CloudFormation, because that's what AWS CDK is doing behind the scenes. So we need to have permissions to do that through the AWS CDK. And then also we need permissions to create whatever infrastructure we're trying to create here. So I'm trying to create an S3 bucket. That means I need the S3 create bucket policy. So I'm going to head over to the AWS console really quick to do that. So I'm just going to log in really quick here. Oh God, I hate this. So yeah, 5Q CSR. Let's see how many times I fail. That's first. BQTNFM. That's twice. 483CZH. Please. Oh, thank you. So this should be, I believe that, and we should be good to go here. Okay, perfect. So just like going back here, this is where you would have landed. So we're going to the IAM section and clicking on IAM, and we're going to go to the user section over here on the left. And this is a default user that I don't want to use. I want to create a new one. So let's say top left, add user. And for this user, let's call this a CDK deploy user. And we are going to enable this with programmatic access. Going to go to the bottom here. And I just want to create this user just to start as is, and then we'll go ahead with attaching the correct policies to it. So go to next tags, next review. It's going to give us a warning that's saying, you're creating a user that has no permissions. This is basically useless. Are you sure you want to do this? I am, because I'm going to add that policy later. So we're going to just click create user in the bottom right. And now we have our access key ID and our secret access key ID. So I'm going to take that. And we're going to go back to our code real quick. I'm going to type in AWS configure in my terminal. And now I'm going to paste in my access key, Alt Tab, and I'm going to paste in the secret access key as well. So when I attach the correct policies to this user, everything is going to work correctly here. Also, by the way, be sure to specify the region that you're operating in, or else you're going to end up deploying to the default region, which I believe is US East 1. So just press enter now. Once that's done, you should be good. Let's go finish the rest of this for setting up our IAM user. So let's close this. We have this user now. What we need to do is create a policy that allows us to deploy what we need. So I'm going to go to policies on the left-hand side here. I'm going to click on that. We're going to click on the top blue button here to create a new policy. And I'm going to do this through JSON since I've already created this policy in advance and I know exactly what it needs to be. So I'm clicking on JSON here, and I have something copied on the side, and I'm going to make this statement available to you in GitHub later so that you can kind of copy this. You don't have to copy it out of the video, which is annoying. So I'll put that in the description section too. So these are the policies that we need in order to deploy to AWS via CloudFormation via CDK. So we need to be able to describe stacks, create change sets, describe them, execute, blah, 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 blah. Also delete if you want to kind of tear down your stuff, which I recommend. And then finally, we have S3 create bucket here, which is what we set up our CDK project to do, or what we set up our CDK stack to do. So that's the policy that we want to apply here. I'm going to go ahead and click on next. I'm going to click on next to review. Let's call this CDK deployer policy. And going to click on create policy. It would only take a moment. Perfect. Let's go back to users now. Go to CDK deploy user. And then we want to add permissions, and then we want to attach the existing policies directly because we just created them. So now we can just put in the search bar CDK deploy, there it is, and we just click on that. If you click on this little triangle here, you can see the policy that you're attaching, which is what I just created. So go ahead and click on review now in the bottom right, click on add permissions, and you should be good to go at this point. I don't think there's any other stuff that we need to do from the IAM perspective. So now we can go back to our code, and if we try to do, well, before we do that, actually, I want to type in CDK diff just to see what this does. Since we don't have anything deployed yet, I wonder what this is going to give us back. So it's giving us, actually, it's just giving us this. So yeah, so this plus sign here with the resource, this is indicating that if you deploy right now, it's going to create your bucket for you. So if you had a bunch of different changes that were all present, they would all show here. So if you're adding and removing, adding will show the plus, removing will show the negative, so that you can kind of get a preview of what's going on. So now at this point, let's clear that. I want to do CDK deploy, and this is going to deploy our stuff out to AWS. So this can take a few moments, especially initially, because it may be doing some bootstrapping right now. But what's neat is that this is going to give us some progress updates as it does so. So you can see here, it's review in progress, it's creating the initial stack, it's creating it, it's doing some CDK metadata stuff, CDK create in progress for our bucket, which is called this. And then it's giving you some indicators here for the progress. So for create complete, it's done with our CDK metadata. Now it's done with our my special bucket. And now everything is done here. So we've basically created our S3 bucket here. So now if I go back to our AWS console and I go to S3, I should be able to see what's going on with this new bucket. So it should be present if all things work correctly. What did I call it? My special bucket? My special, there it is. Okay, so it's appended with this extra thing. Oh, okay, so it's appended with our stack or our app name. So I'm not sure if that's default or what, but that may be possible to override. So that's basically it for setting this up. So just to give you a preview now of like, what does the diff process look like if I want to remove this? So let's go back to our code really quick. Getting started, let's just lower this a little bit. Now I'm going to delete this line. Actually, I'll comment this out. And now if I bring this back up, do clear and do CDK diff, this should show us that we're tearing down that S3 bucket. So, okay, so I'm not authorized to perform get template. So I should probably authorize myself for this policy. Let's just go do that really quick to add that into IAM. IAM and policy. This will just take 2 seconds here, guys. CDK, and I hope it just doesn't require another one, or else that's going to be annoying. Edit, JSON, and we want, what did it say there? Not authorized to perform get template. So grabbing that and put it in quotes, get template, make sure you add a comma, and review policy, save changes, should be good to go. Let's try that again. CDK diff. Hopefully this works. Now we need something else. Actually, you know what? The reason this doesn't work is probably because it's cached. So let me just try again. There we go. So we can see now that we are removing our S3 bucket. So if we were to deploy this right now, we would remove our S3 bucket. So let's go ahead and do that. CDK deploy. And we should see after a minute or so that this bucket gets deleted rather, and that'll be communicated to us through the CDK console as well. When we go back into the S3 section of the AWS console, it should be gone. So let's just let this do its thing for a brief moment here, and you can see it is successful. And you know what? I actually noticed that we have delete skipped here, and this is probably because we have a deletion policy attached to this S3 bucket. Remember when we were doing CDK synth initially, we saw some notion in CloudFormation that says you're not allowed to delete. So that's probably why this is happening. So that didn't quite work as I wanted it to, but just gives you an idea of what can go wrong here. Also wanted to show you how to tear down your entire stack really quick. So if we just get the name of our stack, I believe it was in app.py. Just scroll down here. So ours is called CDK-getting started. So just clearing that, you can do CDK destroy, CDK-getting-started, and this will destroy everything in our CDK stack. And it's just going to ask us for confirmation here. So let's press Y for yes, and it's going to start destroying everything so that you're left essentially with a clean slate. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please check out my other ones on AWS CDK on the right, and as always, please don't forget to like and subscribe.